If we are ready and recording, I'm going to open the council time for Wednesday, September 23rd, and begin with old business. And I would entertain a motion to accept the minutes of our last meeting.
Approved, Madam Chair.
Second. It's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes of the last meeting. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you. Josh, since you're here, are you able then to, are we going to do your discussion now, or are we moving something else? Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Okay.
I wasn't sure with the timing with the Board of Health, so I'll go ahead and just open up the topic and then give the reins over to Josh. So the topic today is to really finalize our legislative priorities, knowing, of course, that things come up and things change, and this isn't something that's going to be set in stone without any way to address issues that come up, particularly as it relates to COVID and the changing situations there. But as Rebecca's pulling up the document, this is the list of tentative legislative priorities that we have talked about to date. And I'll let Josh walk through each of these, but you'll notice that there's the categories of, the prior priorities, new priorities, and then also supporting efforts that are more at a countywide, at a WASAC level, and then some things to continue to monitor as well. And as Josh can talk about too, especially with the changing environment that we have, I think it's fair to say that many legislative sessions, we sort of have themes and ideas of what's going to be bigger issues. We don't even really know what the legislative session is going to look like in terms of if it's going to be in person, what if it's going to be remote voting, how any of those things are going to function. And so I think it's fair to say that this legislative session may be more unpredictable than most, and especially with the budget, in the last few recent years. We've had an increasing budget amount, and it's looking like instead we're reducing that. State departments have been asked to put together 15% budget cut scenarios, and so that's something that just to keep in mind is sort of an overarching theme as we consider all these priorities. But the goal for today's discussion is to finalize these priorities so that in October we can set up our meeting with the legislative delegation. With that, I will hand it over to Josh.
Good morning, and thank you, Lindsay, and Annika Vaughn is with me here, and it's nice to see you. I think last time we were with you, we did just a general sort of what to expect in the 21 session, looking back a little bit at the 2020 session. We just to add on to what Lindsay already said, which is a really good summary, we really are expecting the legislature to be in a virtual format. We're continuing to hear that is in all likelihood what they'll be doing. We also are starting to hear more rumblings that they may in fact come back after the November election for a special session. That was looking pretty unlikely for quite a while, but now is sort of back on the table. And it seems like they probably will have to come back and adopt some rules for how they operate in a virtual format at the beginning of the year. They will be in a mode of budget austerity. But I will just say today is the quarterly meeting of the Economic Revenue Forecast Council for the state. The last time they got together in June was when what's the basis of the information you hear on the media a lot about the state having a $8 or $9 billion problem in the next 4 years. That as of today, that number has been cut about in half. And we've been seeing this come in. They do monthly updates on revenue. And we've been seeing revenues come in much more stronger than was forecasted. And so that kind of just firms this up. They now have a $2.4 billion problem for this biennium, so ending in June of next year, and then a $2.1 billion problem for the next biennium. All of this is a little bit hard to predict because so much of the economic activity we've seen in this year so far has been based on those economic unemployment benefits, enhanced unemployment benefits, and stimulus checks. So now that those have run out, we could be seeing a worse worse third and fourth quarter of this year. But I guess the bottom line is they will be in a budget austerity position, but not quite as bad as we had thought before. We do, and I think we talked about this before. If the primary election is any indication what's going to happen in the general election, the Democrats will retain, and words are hard sometimes, right? They will retain the majority and probably grow the majority a little bit. We're hearing from a lot of Democratic legislators that they are not interested in cutting the budget, that they instead will be looking at additional state revenue ideas for how to get out of this problem. So, the gist of this is not a good year to be making operating budget requests. There will be transportation budget discussions, and there will be capital budget discussions. So in that sort of context, these are the priorities that we are proposing at this point. Lindsay's done a great job talking to each of you individually to tee this up. And I'm just going to walk through this, and I'm happy to answer questions as I'm going along. I recognize that's a little harder in the Zoom format, or also to discuss them at the end. And our hope is that we come away today with a head nod from you all that we're focused on the right things so that we can begin talking to the legislative delegation, putting plans together to talk to the legislative delegation. So the first on this is the category of continuing our prior priorities. On the transportation side, we believe that moving up funding for the 179th Street is still the priority for the county. We haven't heard anything from you that would suggest otherwise. In the context for this, I do think it's important to continue talking about this because there is a budget gap in the state transportation budget. And if the Supreme Court upholds Initiative 976, and we do expect that decision, I've heard we expect that decision before session, but if they uphold the initiative and because of COVID-related gas tax revenue declines, it is a question about whether all Connecting Washington projects will continue forward. So we do need to make sure that we are advocating for projects that are important for the county. Even if we are not successful again in moving funding up, we need to have this project on the list to make sure that we're playing defense and saying that it's still an important project for the county. We also are suggesting that we continue discussions on sales tax leakage, and we do not have a proposal or a specific request on this, but the state, as I mentioned, will be talking about ways to look at their own revenue structure. And I think we need to be in there at every opportunity saying that as part of their revenue structure, they need to figure out ways to mitigate for counties like Clark County, where sales tax is not an equal or equitable funding mechanism for county services because of the leakage issue. So this, in my mind, would be a general policy statement about the state addressing sales tax leakage. Similarly, on the 0.09 for economic development, this would be as we've talked before, this would be a negative impact to the state general fund. So it is very unlikely that they would do something on this session. Having said that, we do think it's still an important mechanism that the legislature should consider for mitigating jurisdictions like Clark County. We think it's important to keep it on the discussion list. The other thing that's going on with this is WASAC, in its conversation right now about possible priorities, is considering flexing up the 0.09 economic development funds for affordable housing for a short-term time period. And I think it is possible that the legislature will be talking about making policy changes to the $0.09. If they do that, I think we want to be in that conversation saying that there's a way that they could further amend the program to be beneficial for Clark County. I think that's probably a long shot, but would be the strategy I recommend. CASA funding is, important. I think it's important to continue talking about. Clark County really has been leading this conversation. I know that other counties feel the pressure of not having adequate funding for the CASA program, but you're the ones really that have been leading the charge on this. For that reason, I think it's good to continue talking about, but I do think that it also is a new funding request and seems very unlikely in this environment. Part of the reason on keeping these on our agenda is really looking forward to the future when the state is not in as dire a budget situation, wanting to maintain some momentum from items we've been talking about, projecting forward to when maybe we have a better opportunity. On the new priorities category, Lindsay and I have talked about the fact that you have some pretty significant costs at your fairground for housing livestock. I'm not sure, there may be other wildfire related expenses. The state will be considering a package of funding primarily related to wildfire fighting costs, but I think there's an opportunity to ask for reimbursement for the county for the costs that you have incurred because of the wildfires. This is one that I think is particularly viable if we get interest from the delegation on. If we don't get a lot of bites from the delegation on this, they would need to really carry the water for us, but seems like a very reasonable request. Moving to WASAC and their efforts on COVID, they're still in the process of identifying their legislative requests, but we know that there will be something on their agenda related to responding to COVID. And frankly, even if WASAC didn't talk about it, the legislature has been thinking so long about COVID response now that they will be doing something on this. We know that there's public health expenses. We know that they're considerable. We know that they're beyond the CARES funding that you've received. There's also emergency response expenses. I think it's just the legislature is very attuned right now to the fact that counties have had these costs, and we should figure out a way to itemize what we think is reasonable and be putting this forward as that discussion occurs. There will be a local fiscal flexibility bill. I believe we talked about that before. It's worth watching that issue space and seeing if there is something in the final version of that bill that actually would be helpful for us. I know one thing they're talking about right now is a short-term ability to use REIT 2 funds for maintenance of facilities. That could be helpful. The other component of this as well is that there will be legislation this next year to change the 1% cap on property tax collections. The proposal, similar to what WASAC has proposed for many years in the past now, is to have a floating cap which would track with inflation and population growth rather than a set 1%. I think it's important that if that opportunity does come up, that local governments are unified to be supporting that proposal. There's also in this bullet the idea that we need to be protecting and talking about protecting the shared revenues that the state does pass down to counties. And we've talked about this before, but during the recession, we saw reductions to those revenues and was very harmful. Rural broadband is on here too. Frankly, everybody is interested in rural broadband. This is probably one of the 3 policy topics that I would put pretty high wager that the legislature will do something on. The budget and police reform and broadband would be third on this. It's unclear at this point whether they will do something that is purely expanding financial resources as they have currently done through the Public Works Assistance Account, through the, oh man, I'm blanking on the other infrastructure program they've been funding through. I apologize. Or if there is provision of ability for PUDs and ports to provide retail service. Right now, they don't have the authority to provide retail service, but they're asking for it. And then there's sort of another angle on this, which is providing programs to make sure there's better equity in broadband service, even in areas where you have the infrastructure. Do the communities there have the technology and the skill set to be able to access the services that they have? So there's an equity lens that's being talked about also. So something will happen on broadband. It's very hard at this point for me to advise you specifically what to be asking for, but we know they're going to be talking about it and that there's probably some benefit there for the residents of the county.
Josh, I think the other program was CURB.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I could see by the look on your face that you remembered, and it just was escaping me. In terms of supporting, but not necessarily taking a lead on, we know there will be discussion about the I-5 bridge. Annika and I have been tracking the Oregon-Washington task force, and we know there's a lot of activity there. It's a little unclear to me right now whether this is something they do this session. It will probably be tied to a possible transportation revenue package. We talked a little bit before about the shared revenues, but also possible sweeps from the Public Works Assistance account, which we saw in the recession as well. Having some statement around protecting those revenue sources would be really advisable. There's also in the monitoring category, I mentioned that law enforcement reforms, police reform is going to be one of the huge topics of the session. I don't know that Clark County wants to necessarily have a proactive position on that. I do have other municipal clients that are making a statement about supporting police reform. I don't necessarily think it hurts you not to have a statement, but we should be aware of what they're talking about. And some of those positions, as WASAC has discussed, have the possibility of converting into unfunded mandates. And all of the associations and other local governments are aware of that and are preventing or are concerned about preventing that. But I recommend that we pay very close attention to that space. I mentioned tax code changes with regard to the state creating additional revenue at the state level. I think there is opportunity. There is a group of lobbyists that have been, local government lobbyists that have been starting to meet, talking about ways that we might suggest that the state help local governments at the same time that they're helping themselves. I don't know how much at the forefront of that conversation Clark County wants to be, but it's something that we for sure will be keeping you informed about. And then finally, there's a very active conversation going on with stakeholders and legislators this interim about changes to the Growth Management Act. Those on the sort of positive side for counties, there's conversation about how to make local areas of more intensive rural development or landwards more effective. There's conversations around annexation, as well as potentially adopting what they're talking about as a growth management light for smaller and slower growing counties to be able to get out of some of the GMA responsibilities. On the other side, there is a very active conversation about adding climate change to the Growth Management Act and about providing a standard in the GMA of net ecological gain or benefit. With the composition of the legislature, I think it's very likely that if a GMA bill is passed, it will include climate change. I will say, however, that in sort of wrapping up my comments on this, one of the things about the virtual format that we're going to really be testing out with the legislature is just how much they're able to get done. And the GMA, given that it's such a complicated issue and set of issues that so many stakeholders have an interest in, seems like it could be something that gets bogged down pretty easily, particularly in a virtual format. The legislature's priorities, as I mentioned, are going to be the budget, police reform, broadband. I think, those of us that are speculating about this have a lot of skepticism about whether they will be able to process the number of bills and the number of topics that they do in a typical session. But I think they will try on GMA. So those are our thoughts. I'm going to take a breath and see if you all have any questions.
I do have, I have a couple of comments and questions. On the continuation of prior priorities, the continued discussion on ways to address our sales tax leakage. I am wondering, Josh, whether there is available, fairly readily available, kind of the number of counties, their loss of sales tax revenue because they're border counties, and what that would mean to the revenue loss to the state if a bill were passed or even introduced or we focused on something in that way. What kind of impact would that have to the state to kind of cover some of these losses to counties? And if other counties are much lower than Clark County, I'm going to suggest that we should focus even just on our county, because it would be a lower hit of a revenue loss to the state if we were to make up some of those. Because I don't know the answer to this, but I suspect that Clark County is our sales tax leakage is much more because we are so very close to the border of Oregon. I mean, it's just a few miles away for most people.
Yeah, I have never seen the numbers for Whatcom, Spokane, Klickitat, I think are kind of have some of that issue. Waukegan probably has some of that going on too. Intuitively, what you're saying makes sense to me, just given how easy it is and how close Portland is compared to Whatcom County going across to Vancouver or Spokane going across to, I'm not sure quite where. There's not a urban center right across from Spokane like you. I will say that I think it is an extraordinarily difficult environment right now with the legislature to be asking them to provide any additional new resources. I think that we need to continue to raise the issue and make the point. But I just haven't seen any willingness. Even in last year when they had a lot of new revenue projected, they weren't willing to do I think it was $10 million a year for the 0.09 proposal.
Okay, and I understand that. They don't want to lose any revenue. However, it is our taxpayers' money. It's not the state's. So that's my point of view, not theirs, of course. Then the other thing, I had a slight question about, or came to my mind when you were talking about the reimbursement of wildfire expenses. For instance, for our fairgrounds and providing some place for animals to be. If the majority of those animals were coming across the border from Oregon, would we still be able to try to collect that?
I don't know. I mean, maybe that's an argument that gets used against us, but at the same time, it sort of feels to me that you're in a very dire circumstance where, you're coming together as a region. Is the state going to shut its doors on Clark County's actual costs because they were helping people from across the river? I don't know.
It's my hope they wouldn't, but I'm just saying I guess we should be ready for that possibility. But I would hope that it is a really more of a Good Samaritan attitude that, we are a region, we have these fires that cross the river, really, in the case. So anyway, there you have it. I just wanted to bring that up. Are there other questions or comments of the council?
If I may, Madam Chair, and I want to go right immediately to what you were just asking about regarding tax leakage. And I had previously sent to at least you, maybe I didn't, but I have a cross-border study that was done in 2014 regarding, it's focused on tax leakage. And so obviously it's a little dated, but it's a good study, and it specifically states that Clark County is by far the most impacted of all the border counties. So I do have that. I'll send it to everyone for if you want to read it. As to that, so when you brought up whether or not we should pursue it, I think we should, at least to keep the conversation going. My question is, do we just make a broad request, or do we actually draft something more specific? I have heard the retention of 0.18% of our own sales tax would make us whole. I don't know that for a fact because I'm not an accountant, but that's what I've been told. So I'm wondering if, just to keep the narrative going, whether we should provide something more specific. And the fact that the few border counties that are impacted in very dissimilar ways, to me, speaks to some kind of formula or graduated formula that would impact the state revenues the least, but make those border counties on a par with all the other counties under the existing tax structure that we have now. So that's my question, whether it should be more specific to keep the narrative going. I do have some other comments regarding what you've made, but I'll mute myself again.
So I don't remember seeing that, and if I missed it, I apologize, but I would very much like to see that study. That would be very helpful. If we did, in the past, when we've talked about sales tax leakage, we've provided that specific number. I think that's a very good idea, whether we're, it's kind of a technicality about whether we're saying we'd like you to reimburse us this much money. We're making the point that this is what we're losing. And I think, maybe I said this already, but with the state having a tax structure work group underway right now, they are looking at ways to rebalance the state revenue structure. And we need to be interjecting this point into that conversation whenever we get the chance. So I agree with you that we continue talking about it. I think it's a little bit academic about whether we're asking for that money specifically or whether we're just saying this is our problem at this point.
Yeah, I agree with Josh. And what I want to add too is I think that there's a real benefit to being cognizant of the state's budgetary situation right now, that if we come in with a very specific proposal, on the one hand, one thing is that we're not really stuck with it forever, but people will ask, why have you changed? What was wrong with the last proposal? If you come in with a very specific proposal. And secondly, if you come in with a very specific proposal, then it shows that you're almost oblivious to the state's budgetary situation right now, as opposed to coming in and saying, we need to continue this discussion. We understand where the state budget is at. We're at the table with the tax work group. We're having these conversations, but, especially with our delegation saying, we need to continue to be aware of this, continue to be mindful of this. And to the extent that there are opportunities, it then provides us that flexibility to be more nimble to respond to the opportunities that may come up this year.
Thank you. And I did send to most everyone that study, so you should be getting it in your email account. Madam Chair, may I make some additional comments?
Yes, go ahead.
So I'm really strongly in favor of jumping on board of any broadband initiatives. I've been hopefully working with Lindsay and others and reaching out and trying to find any federal or state source to improve, whether even CARES Act funding, if we could somehow justify it to connect the impact of the pandemic on our school children and people working remotely in the rural areas that have no broadband connectivity. So I want to jump all over that. As to your CASA, statement, we could, that's also a narrative that needs to continue because we have indigent defense, we've got guardian ad litem, CASA, unrepresented litigants. I mean, all of these things need to be addressed by the state, and the state bar could address some of this as well. So, for instance, unrepresented litigants, a lot of states require of their bar members to perform a certain number of volunteer hours per year. I don't think we do anything like that here in Washington State, but CASA needs to go back to volunteer funding. We need to get it out of our general funding. But the indigent defense is a big bullet, and we really need state help on that. The other comment I would make on the capital projects regarding the 179th, I'm wondering if it would be more practical to say, hey, we just want to preserve it. We don't need to advance it any longer because we don't really know the rate of development out there, whether it'll impact us that dramatically if we don't get it earlier. Obviously, it would have been great to get it early, but I'm wondering if it would be more practical just to say, hey, we want to preserve it, but let's not worry about advancing it. And then the last comment I wanted to make ties back to the tax leakage. I mean, I personally wouldn't want to support removing the 1% property tax lid, but I would consider doing that if we could leverage our support with a bill that would support relief from tax leakage, as long as it is up to the council once they see the budget, once they know whether or not we need to increase taxes within that 1%, or if they change it to 2%, as long as we have full control of that as a council to see what's prudent for our own budget. But so if we could leverage one over the other, I'd consider doing it. Otherwise, I would just want to monitor that and not provide any positive support.
Yeah, the 1% proposal that has come up or has been put forward in the past is a local option, right? So you would have the ability at the council level to say, maybe you have, with the combination of inflation, population growth, you have the ability to raise it by 2.5%, but you only think you need 1%, so you only raise it 1%, similar to what you do right now with taking the 1% at all. One thing I have thought about before, I think it would be very viable. Now, I know you probably don't want to do this, but if the county wanted to propose a particular local option revenue source that would mitigate sales tax as opposed to sales tax, I am pretty sure the legislature would be willing to give you that authority. The idea that came to me was an additional levy lid lift for property taxes that only counties in your situation would be able to impose at a value equal to what you're losing for sales tax. I know where I think I know where most of you are on taxes. I'm not sure if there's an argument that your Clark County constituents are taking advantage of Oregon's lower sales tax rate, and that it is equitable enough to justify a slightly higher property tax rate. I don't know. Only you could answer that question. But I think that type of proposal would be a lot more politically feasible than asking the state to compensate you for the sales tax revenue that is going across the border.
My only comment is that's dead on arrival with me personally. I'm not looking to increase the tax burden on our local citizens. I'm looking to even the playing field with all our local counties with the tax structure we have in place to make up with, it wouldn't be for our county alone. It would have virtually no impact on state revenues if we were able to keep our 0.18%. And that would give us about $25 million more into our general fund where we could fund a public defender or something like that. I mean, we could do great things if we were whole. We would eliminate our structural deficit. and with little impact to state revenues. I'm not looking to increase taxes. I'm just looking to better use the structure that we have presently in Washington State.
And I think one of the things that, has been a challenge for us in pursuing that type of route is that there's the argument to be made, and it's a sound argument, though it certainly can be debated. Why should somebody who's in Spokane County, who's in Grant County, have to have their tax dollars diverted to Clark County as opposed to having Clark County solve Clark County's issues? And that's an argument that if we, in the future, and I think keeping it as a more vague priority for now, but in the future, we'll have to consider with any type of proposal that we would put together in any more definitive fashion.
Councilor Olson, is that you? I can't, my frame doesn't show who's.
Okay, yes, it's me.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I think just generally on the tax leakage discussion, I think we just sort of keep that discussion alive. And from my perspective, with the reality that we know nothing's going to happen this year, but we at least keep the conversation alive. And that provides us opportunities to talk about what some solutions might be over time to help mitigate this. It'd be nice if our community shopped in Clark County and not in Portland. That would be helpful, but that's also not the answer either, because they've got more restaurants than we do. They have a Nordstrom and we don't. So that, that's not 100% solution. So, so maybe there's some behavioral things we can influence over time. But Councilor Mavis, I already have that study. I've had it for a few years now, so I'm glad you have it. It's and I actually have some updated numbers too that I've gotten over the years, and it's significant. So I think just generally continuing that conversation makes a lot of sense. What the answer is right now, that's going to be the challenge. I do have a question about new priorities and whether this might make sense for the council, and maybe Josh, you can provide feedback. I've had conversations with a handful of our local delegation about the CARES Act funding and the part that the state is continuing to hold on to that we believe we should have received, and that they would be willing to have a discussion about that. So I don't know, maybe if we could put that on our new business priorities, that if they go, especially if they go into special session, that would be a good time for us to lobby them to really take a hard look at this, and maybe they can have an impact on our ability to actually receive that money. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess my thought is that that's particularly, as you say, for special session, a really very good idea. My recollection is that the state, I can't remember if the state gets to hang on to that money past the first of the year themselves. I know that they are very interested in making sure that they spend as much of the money as possible.
The question is whether they spend it or they give it to us to spend. And
right.
It was, the guidance was for us to spend it in our community, not having to make those decisions.
I think that would be really great, particularly if we had, some very specific ideas for how we wanted to spend the money. I think that's particularly for our delegation, that's a very good request for them to be done.
And Lindsay, you can pipe in, we've done that work. I mean, our finance group has done that work. Our treasurer's office has done that work. So we've done that work. So I think we're really in a good place to make that ask if the council is interested in doing that.
I would concur with that. I think, though, that this would be more special session subject than regular session, since the regular session doesn't happen until January, correct? I mean, the money will have been spent or gone, but I completely concur that our delegation should really be helping Clark County citizens by responding in this way.
Yeah, and it would be really a special session topic, and I know that they understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good idea.
Madam Chair.
Hey, Councilor Baum.
So, Josh, as we're talking about the tax issue and trying to think how to make this something that the rest of the state, the rest of the counties would care about, do you know if WASAC has looked at in some way shifting the share of sales tax and property tax to allow counties to keep more of their own property tax and sending less to the state in exchange for sales tax. And I think the argument could be that property tax is much more stable. It allows counties to have a more predictable budget. We have fewer sources of revenue than the state does. And so the state, I think the argument made, the state is better equipped to deal with the volatility of sales tax. It also deals with rural counties that they may not have cross-state sales tax leakage, but if you're in a area, to Councilor Olson's point, where there isn't shopping, you're forced to go to more urban areas to do some of that shopping. So you're losing that sales tax revenue to other counties. So is that something, as they're looking at the broader tax reform, would that be a spot to maybe keep that conversation going in terms of why sales tax is a third leg of our revenue, not just for Clark County, but for a lot of counties? And could that build a little broader coalition?
I think it's a really very good idea. There is an issue with property taxes specifically. The state portion of the property tax constitutionally has to be dedicated to basic education. So without a constitutional amendment, we're not able to get into the state portion. You could potentially talk about, the other portions of the property tax. You're running up then against the ports and the fire districts in the cities, those other entities. And I'm not sure if that's what you were thinking about. When WASAC talks about revenue issues of counties on a broad scale, the border counties have traditionally brought up sales tax leakage. And I think other counties typically recognize that it is a particular problem in the context of rebalancing the overall county revenue situation. I've also seen, to be blunt, some other counties, particularly smaller counties, who aren't particularly sympathetic to Clark and Spokane and Whatcom in particular, because they look at it and say, yes, you're losing sales tax revenue, but your sales tax base is still so much bigger than ours. We would love to have that problem. So sometimes you get a little bit of that sentiment from some of the smaller counties. There hasn't been a collective countywide revenue solution discussed in a few years. The Legislative Steering Committee this last week, I think it was, talked a bit about this. And, the biggest solution on the table, it seems to me, from their perspective, is the 1%. So I'm not sure if that's much of an answer, but I do think that there is, there needs to be a fix for counties generally, and I think there's going to be more help for Clark County getting leakage addressed in that broader approach than maybe the one-off approach. It is. Oh, I wanted to add to Councilor Medvedi. You made the point about I think it was $25 million. It is not that much to the state and their budget. That is true. However, 2 years ago, we were making the push for indigent defense, and where I think the state generally recognizes that they have a pretty significant liability and responsibility. We counties generally couldn't get the state to invest $25 million in that first year, phasing in that approach for even indigent defense. So the idea of getting that much money for Clark County alone for a single jurisdiction approach to fixing a statewide problem, that is how they think about those issues, I guess, is my point. So I know that it feels unfair. I think it is unfair, frankly, for Clark County. It's just very difficult to get across to break the way legislators tend to think about those issues.
I also kind of think there may be a danger when we talk about the stools of taxation and foundation of taxation. What we are doing is, if we press too much or anyway, if we press too much, the answer is going to be an income tax, and that is not good. So, any other comments of the council before Josh or before we finish this discussion? Hearing none. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I appreciate the feedback. I will circle back with Josh and we'll finalize these and then work on getting the legislative delegation meeting set up for October.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Josh and Monica.
Yeah, thanks for the time. Good to see you all.
All right, thanks. Thank you. Okay, our next item is the CARES Act funding.
Good morning, Council. Can you hear me? I hope you can hear me. This is thank you. So this is to follow up to the conversation that we had last week. So we have two staff reports in front of you. I'm going to go over the first one. Michael will do the second one. So the first staff report is really just kind of a continuation of what we're doing right now with the quarantine isolation site, motel expansion for those who are at high risk to COVID, and then also continuation of the services to support the homeless system through November, along with program support and indirects we have in there. I do know Larry Stafford is talking to the state today about the indirects to try to get an answer one way or another for us. But this is what we are bringing forward for your approval today for the homeless system to include supporting public health with the quarantine and isolation site.
Are there questions of the council or comments? By the way, Vanessa, we were all raising our thumbs to tell you we could hear you, but you're not on video, so you probably can't see us. Anyway, any questions of the council? Okay, if there are no questions, I guess she's asking for approval, so I'd entertain a motion to approve this.
Move to approve.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the community service CARES funding. Any discussion, any further discussion? Hearing and seeing none. All in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you. Michael will do the second staff report, which is about the business support, small business support.
All right, thank you.
Good morning, counselors. Michael Torres, Program Manager at Clark County Community Services. And we are here to get CARES Act funding for the Small Business Assistance Program, as we discussed last week. I did see this morning there is one mistake in the staff report that I do want to bring your attention to, so that what is approved is correct. This is for emergency funding that we receive. We're using CARES Act funding from State Department of Commerce to fund emergency small business assistance by providing grants and subsidized loans to the small businesses that are hit hard by the pandemic. But the eligible businesses are completely within Clark County. It does not exclude the city of Vancouver. That is a restriction that we would normally have with community development block grant funds, but with these CARES Act funds, we can serve everyone, and we want to take advantage of that. So I just want to bring your attention to that, so that you are aware and as we discussed last week, we are asking for $1,005,000 in small business assistance. That is broken down by $500,000 going to Mercy Corps Northwest, $500,000 going to Fourth Plane Forward. That is one difference. It's an increase from what we discussed last week. Fourth Plane, when we spoke with you last week, Fourth Plane Forward said that they could use about $165,000. We've been in discussions with them since our last week, where you are very interested in increasing the small business assistance to the community as much as possible. They are willing and do believe they can spend out up to $500,000 between now and November 30th. So that request has been updated. Also, as you requested us to look into how can personal protective equipment be provided and distributed to small businesses in the county. We do have, it sounds like a small amount, but it actually will buy quite a bit of PPE. But we have $5,000 requested, and that's going to be used by Mercy Corps Northwest, Fourth Plane Forward, and the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce to distribute PPE to small businesses that need it. There's $10,000 in program support, 10% indirect de minimis, as Vanessa discussed. I know Larry Stafford is working that issue with the Department of Commerce for $101,500. So the total small business assistance request is $1,116,500. And if you have any questions, I can answer them.
And let me just add one point on this. Childcare, businesses that provide childcare are built into the organizations that we are working with to address Councilor Lance's comment that if they are fall up in these criteria, they are willing to also help support childcare.
Okay, are there questions of the council? I just wanted to clarify, Michael, you said these businesses are within unincorporated Clark County, even though they could be used for the city. Could you restate that?
Sure. So any eligible business that is a small business, low, moderate income, that has been hit hard by COVID-19, by the economic downturn, is eligible, regardless of whether they are within the city limits or in unincorporated Clark County or in any city within the county. If it's within Clark County, they are eligible. And the city of Vancouver does have its own small business assistance program. They're using community development block grant dollars for that. We are working very, very closely with the city of Vancouver. We are meeting with them, with Mercy Corps Northwest, Fourth Plane Forward every week. Actually, so far, it's generally been about twice a week to make sure that anyone that is eligible for assistance is receiving the assistance that they are eligible for, and that there are no duplication of services. So we are doing a lot of deconflicting in terms of who the applicants are, what they're getting, and that what they are getting, they are eligible for.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? If not, I would entertain a motion.
Move to approve.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the community services use of CARES Act funding to respond to COVID-19 pandemic for small business. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chair O'Brien, this is Kathleen. I
Yes.
just want to, while both Vanessa and Michael present this in such a professional manner, I just want to recognize the two of them and their staff and Lindsay, because working with our local partners in the community, this was not an easy task to do, looking at capacity and logistics. So while it looks like it was presented, and there's a lot of effort and work that has gone into support the council's priority. So I just wanted to recognize that their department and Lindsay as well.
Thank you very much. And we do thank you, all of you, the whole group of staff that's been working on this. I can understand it would be difficult, but we appreciate it. Thanks.
Madam Chair, I assume we're moving, sorry, it looks like we're going to be moving on to the next item. Is that correct? So I have just a quick question on the CARES Act topic. So last week we talked about the additional almost $20 million that we're potentially going to have. And I'm wondering when we're going to have a more detailed conversation about that. Purpose and specifically, am I remembering correctly from last week? I'm not.
Actually, I appreciate you bringing that up. I just, what I'd like to say is I was going to ask that question. I should have written it down here regarding this small business and somebody contacting CREDC and speaking to them about the ability maybe for them to help distribute some of these funds to our small business owners. So that would also be my question. Where are we on that?
So
This is Kathleen again, and I'll just chime in really quick on the for the $9.7 million contract that has been signed for the General CARES Act funding and has been sent up to Olympia. And Mark will have to confirm if we've actually received a contract for public health. I have not seen that specifically. And Lindsay can address the CREDC question.
So on CREDC, I was able to connect with the director of CREDC, Jennifer Baker, and unfortunately, given the timeline and given the fact that grant administration is outside of the typical business that CREDC does, it's not really their main course of business. She's estimating that they could move probably about 2.5 million. And so 1.2 million of that would be, as I think most of you are aware, CREDC administered prior CARES Act related grant funds, and there was more interest, more demand than there was supply for those grant funds. And so there's about $1.2 million of grant fund requests from Clark County businesses, in which those businesses have been vetted to be eligible for these type of funds, in which that money could get out the door relatively quickly because, as I said, the vetting of those businesses has been done. An additional 100,000 she's anticipating that could be used for Main Street programs. We have the Main Street associations in Richfield, Camas, and then also potentially Washougal. And then doing the remaining of those funds to be used for an additional round of grant funds. Her recommendation, obviously it's up to the council, but her recommendation, since we are doing the money for Mercy Corps, is to use the CREDC funds to target those businesses that are between 10 and 49 employees. That's a fairly standard range for what we've seen from other jurisdictions, and do a grant for those. Obviously, the minimum requirements would be what would be required by the CARES Act, and then the council could determine any other criteria prioritization within that. But she anticipates that that's about all that they could probably move within the timeline. We would need to get clarification from Larry Stafford, and I know that everybody's working on this, so it's certainly not it's an issue that everybody's trying to grapple with, and quickly, is what we could do for the administrative fees. They anticipate needing to bring on a part-time staff member to help with this process. And so that obviously has a cost associated with it. And so somewhere between, 4% roughly, potentially a little bit more in terms of the admin fees would need to come out of those funds or a different fund source in order to be able to do that. So that's something we're working through right now, to try and get those answers and see if that's possible. Obviously, from the numbers that were thrown out at the last meeting, I think that doesn't quite get us to the amount that the council was hoping in terms of the small businesses and the grants. So the question then becomes, what do we do? And I've reached out to a couple other stakeholders in the community to say, okay, do you have any ideas of how we can do this? Because we have a fairly short timeline. So a couple other folks are putting their heads together, trying to come up with ideas. So hopefully I'll have a more definitive update for you. But it's in the works, it's in process. But I wanted to get your thoughts in terms of whether or not what CREDC was proposing is something you want to move forward with, and then continue to look for another avenue, whether it's in-house or another external entity, to help us with the other funds that we're hoping to put forward to the small business.
I'm wondering if there are some grant makers in the community that could actually handle this. We'd have to put together the criteria quickly. But I would agree that CREDC can distribute what they can distribute of those, to those folks who have already made application, but they just didn't have the money to spread it. But I would like to see us at least try, maybe speak with other grant makers and other entities, nonprofits, whatever, that do this sort of thing, this sort of at least looking at requests, grant requests, et cetera. And if they need help with the criteria, we could use some of what other, not reinvent the wheel, find out what other communities are using in order to create criteria for this so that we could do this fairly quickly.
Yeah, and the
And-
criteria in terms of, you know, what the CARES Act is requiring and kind of those basic criteria. Other jurisdictions have done that. That's easy. That's easy to put together. The only thing would be if, for example, I know Councilor Lenz brought up childcare. And so if the council wanted to award additional points or things to gear towards certain businesses, the policy decision that maybe other jurisdictions haven't done. I think that the main questions where there's a lot of variability amongst the other jurisdictions, what type, what size of business. Some are really trying to target smaller, some are targeting ones up to 50 or 100 employees. Excuse me. And then what size is the maximum amount of the grant? I think if, you know, while we want to touch as many businesses as possible, looking at this amount of money to move this amount of money in the time that we have, I think that a maximum grant amount of closer to 25,000 is probably more appropriate than what we've seen from other jurisdictions where they've capped it at 10, just because in order to make sure that we are as effective in getting this money out the door and touch as many people as we can. As Marcus said, I'd rather not send it back to the state. So if we can set that amount and see that it's justified at the grant admin level, then setting that higher amount will ensure that we can most effectively use the dollars.
Madam Chair.
Councilor Olson.
So I did have a conversation yesterday with John McDonough, Vancouver Chamber, and he said they thought they could handle it. And they have a pretty county-wide stretch now with Battleground. And I said, you think you can give out $10 or $20 million in this period of time? And he said they are set up and designed to do those sorts of things and working with our businesses locally. So I don't know, specifically the details around that, but Lindsay, if you wanted to reach out to John, he said they could probably do it.
Perfect. I'll reach out to John.
And I think the other thing too is if we can find out some of the criteria maybe that other jurisdictions are using, it might be helpful for us as a council to go through and say, yeah, we want this, we don't want that, so there's a list before us so we can make some determination about how to vet some of these requests. But I think that's a great idea if the chamber's able to take it on. I'm sure there are people that aren't actually members of the chamber, but if they could make requests anyway, if the chamber can get that news out somehow, that would be good. Or we, as the county as well, could get that out to our business owners. That would be good.
I'll reach out to John for sure.
Thank you. Okay, moving on then to our next topic, Harmony Sports Complex.
Good morning, Council. This is Ahmad Kayumi. So I'm going to introduce the project and then we'll introduce our staff who's going to go over and give you an update. So thank you so much for your time. So I want to talk about Harmony Sport Complex. It is located at the southwest corner of Northeast 18th Street and 192nd Avenue. It is within the city of Vancouver. So I want to give you an update on the project and the efforts that's been made since the time you approved the contract to do the work and the design for the parking lot, the grant that we received from the State Commerce, also some money from the county and also from the Harmony Sport Complex Association. And since then, we have talked to the City of Vancouver, and also we found out some of the additional information that additional development activity is going to be happening within Section 30 and compliance with their master plan. So with that, I'd like to introduce our team. Galina Burley, she's our Parks Manager and Land Manager. Also Grant DeYoung, and also from PA's office, Bill Richardson, and so they can go over the details of that. And I'll interject on another couple items, but they will be leading the presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Galina.
Galina, before you begin, I want to extend to you my sympathy. I understand you had a great loss, and I want to extend my sympathies to you. You're muted.
Galena, it looks like we can't hear you, so you may want to mute yourself on your end and call in by the phone, possibly.
We're having technical difficulties.
Okay, Galena, can you try and speak?
Can you hear me a little better?
Yes.
There is a mute. I mean, there is an echo.
If you can mute yourself on your end, Galena, on the computer, I think we should be able to eliminate that feedback.
All right, let's try it again. Sorry, I didn't get a chance to test the mic. I do apologize for this. Is this a little better? Okay. Okay,
yes,
now I
you're
can
good.
hear you. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you again for those words. I really appreciate it. As Ahmad mentioned, we would like to give you an overview of a very important relationship we have with Harmony Sports Complex and some of the things that are included in our history of working together, as well as where we are now. I would like to go to the next slide, which covers some of the key points that we would like to cover today, which include some background history. You already know the location, lease and agreements that we've had with the organization, Section 30 development, construction, future plans for construction of Northeast 13th Street and impact to the site. A little bit of information about a grant opportunity that we have with the State Department of Commerce, a work plan as of this date, and some of the work we've done with the Harmony Association, the city, and here internally, and then request some guidance from you on next steps. Next slide. So as I mentioned, this is a very important relationship and very much long-term. Based on our records, it appears that we first started leasing to Harmony Sports Association in 1982. We've had a lease and various lease amendments with the organization. Since then, the current base lease was approved in 2012, and it outlines the current property boundaries. There have been a couple of amendments to the base lease. One was for construction of turf fields, and another one for sale of alcohol for up to 3 events per year, and one for a grant application for construction of another turf field. Next, please. Here's the lease boundary. So in the red, what you see is what is included as a boundary for Harmony Sports Complex to use at the site. About 40 acres of it is a parks land, and about 18 acres at the very top, bordering 18th, is a BPA easement. We have a sublease with Harmony Sports Complex to use that area as well. Next slide, please. And this is just a different way of looking at the layout. So the fields that we've mentioned are below. The 3 fields have been used RCO, Recreation and Conservation grant funding. A lot of work that you see around this area has been done by Harmony Sports Complex over the last many, many years. Next, please. I'm going to turn it over now to Bill Richardson to cover some of the key points related to the base lease, and then to Ahmad to talk about the Section 30 development. Bill, go ahead.
So this is a 30-year 30-year term lease. As Galena had stated, that's based off of the newest of the lease documents, which would be the 2012 document, taking this lease through 2042. The ability to make this a 30-year lease was based on the amount of capital expenditure that was required to bring the park up to its current state, to include the installation of turf fields. And as you all probably know, Clark County Code requires that leases at this length have to be accompanied by a finding that there is a need to recapture some of the capital investments of the tenant, which is what was done here. So again, this goes up to 2042. It requires that Harmony Sports Association maintains its status as a nonprofit group. That's on the slide right now because there was a little question about that recently, but in the most recent viewing of the Secretary of State Business Search site, it shows that they in fact did file the proper documentation on the 21st of September to put them in active status, so that's no longer an issue. One of the issues that's going to come up, which you see at the bottom of the slide, is what is called the one-to-one replacement ratio. And the reason I bring that up out of order is that it plays into this Bonneville Power easement sublease. So there's this property at the north end of the park that we do not own, but that Bonneville Power Administration has allowed us to use for soccer field purposes. And in turn, we've allowed Harmony Sports Association to use it for its soccer purposes. When it comes to the amount of land that we own, we do not own that land in the north, so we need to be careful in how we discuss that in future discussions with Harmony Sports Association when it comes to what land is included under this lease and what land is not. The leases to date have required that the Harmony Sports Association allows public access to the park at times when there are not scheduled games. That was modified in, I believe, 2015 or 2017 when they started putting in the synthetic turf fields. Those are excluded from that public access. Specifically, the public has access to other parts of the park when it's not being used by Harmony Sports Association, but they do not have access to the turf fields, probably for maintenance purposes. That is in the lease. Harmony retains the right to charge fees. That's their income side. They're allowed to make site improvements, but they can only do so after notice to the county and approval by the county, to include the construction of buildings that support the facilities on the park. Again, all this is covered within the lease. Failure to get county approval for any type of improvement built on the site is actually a breach of the lease conditions, but I don't believe that there's been an allegation of that up to this point. Harmony retains the maintenance and operations duties under the lease. Additionally, they pay for all utilities and well, I don't know if they pay for well use. They did replace the well a little while back and did some maintenance on it, but the ongoing maintenance and operation of the well that's on site is actually done by the county, which is part of the cost to the county to operate this site. And again, the next bullet says Harmony is responsible for most of the O&M, and that is true, the operations and maintenance. The county expenditure for operating that well and doing some of the land maintenance, like some mowing, some graveling, some grading, is $28,000 annually. And the interesting part about, and some of you may know this, some of you may not know this, but there's been recent discussion about the potential for a roadway to come through the park, thus splitting the park. That brought about discussions about a land swap to give Harmony Sports Association a different footprint of land to run their business or whatever you want to call it. And that's what brought up this comparable replacement one-to-one ratio, because it states in the leases that if Clark County is to terminate its relationship with Harmony Sports Association within a certain period of time, that Clark County needs to provide the association with a replacement, 1-to-1 ratio replacement of well, it doesn't say existing, but it says the fields and the facilities. And one of the issues that has been brought up in the discussions regarding land swap is whether that includes proposed build out fields in the future and other proposed facilities. There's nothing mentioned about that in the lease contract, but again, it's this whole issue about whether a roadway is going to be coming through the park that brought up this whole discussion about land swap, which brought up a discussion about what does the 1-to-1 ratio replacement mean in this lease contract. Those are the key points of the lease. If you have any questions, I can answer those.
Questions of the council? Okay. No questions.
Okay. So I can talk a little bit about a couple other slides. So if we can forward to the next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about Section 30 that's within the City of Vancouver, and they have been working on this area for a long time, as it's probably one of the large parcels within the city and economic development that they had, because it's being mined for many years. And the city had, based on a conversation with city staff, the city has approved the master plan for the area for economic development and circulation back in 2009. And they announced major development in 2018, 2019 of, you're probably aware of the HP coming in for a 3D, I think, printer. That's going to be economic development in the area. One of the things that Section 30 master plan includes that extension of 13th Street. That means about 70 feet of right-of-way dedication as part of our site plan, because the project is within the City of Vancouver and we have to go through a site plan approval process. And one of the things that they had told us during the pre-application meeting, that part of the project, when we do the parking in the grant that we have in safety improvement within the area, that it needs to be at least dedicated or in some additional improvement. But what, as Bill mentioned, that 13th Street, what it does is effectively bisects our parks in half. And some of the concerns we had, and that will be about 2.1 acres of loss of the property if that happens. So next slide, please. It's just going to give you a pictorial overview of how the master plan was adopted by council and providing the circulation for that area. And you can see 13th Street going from 192nd all the way to 172nd, and providing the circulation plan with how that's been adopted by City of Vancouver. So I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have on those Section 30 of a master plan.
If I could, Chair.
Councillor Medley.
So, Ahmad, I had asked a question the other day about, do you know the timeline of that quarry, all that master plan being closed and reconstituted and developed? Is this a 10-year plan, a 20-year plan, or is this imminent?
The quarry's been going on for many, many years, and it was probably almost the same time as the Columbia Tech Center, so over 30 years. But that some of the developer activities are imminent. I know we're talking the conversation we have with the property owner, Rajki. They have submitted a master plan on the west side of our park that they're going through the application process on that one. And talking with the city, the HP project, they're talking, and they should be coming for their application. So most of them, those activities are imminent. I'm not sure exact timeline, but they are going through the process right now.
Other questions of the council? Apparently no questions about this part. Councilor Olson?
I apologize. So I'm just looking at this this slide here, and this, the outline of Section 30. Where's the park exactly in here? Is it right here in the middle?
Actually, it's on the northeast corner of the area.
Okay, where this arrow is. Okay.
Yeah.
And this 13th Street is this arrow right here. Okay.
That's where the red arrow, yes. And
Yeah,
that will,
okay.
from from 192nd all the way to 172nd Avenue.
And so when the city of Vancouver adopted this plan, I mean, I'm trying, the park and the complex was already there.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think of the master plan had contemplated moving the park some different location. They had some concepts of moving that and how to accommodate, but it was just mainly concept, nothing really more major beyond that.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So with that, I'll turn it over to Galina.
Thank you, Ahmad. Why are we here today? You've already heard from Ahmad and Bill that there are a multitude of logistics that have come to light when we received a grant from the state to make improvements at the site. In 2017, Clark County and Harmony applied for a grant from the State Department of Commerce for various parking and safety improvements. The state grant is a little over $1 million, the county contribution almost $3 million, and Harmony, through various fundraising efforts and in-kind, have a match of over $700,000. Back in 2017, a site plan was submitted to the city, and during the pre-application conference, city required the dedication of 70 feet of right-of-way for the future construction of Northeast 13th. It appears that since that time, the site plan did not move forward, and that one of the issues that was brought up to light was the loss of about 2 acres, and then, of course, having the street run through a very active and busy facility. Next 2 slides just kind of cover some of the things, some of the work, some of the community outreach, engagement, and communications that have taken place since about the middle of 2019 through about now. There's been multiple conversations, of course, with our partner, Harmony Sports Association. Staff have also worked with McKay and Spacito on approaching various types of preliminary concepts for the site. Clark County met with the city to discuss Section 30. Discussions with Harmony have occurred concurrently. There's been meetings and discussions with the nearby landowner to see if they would be interested in potential relocation and land swap. County discussed potential relocation with the Harmony Sports Complex from about November 2019 through now. There's been, like I said, various concepts reviewed. Where we are now, if we could go to the next slide. We had, at a request from Harmony Sports Association, had wanted to bring this up to your attention, as well as we had asked Harmony Sports Association to come to our Parks Advisory Board meeting in August and had a very robust discussion with the advisory members. We also had the City of Vancouver Planning and Community Development staff come to our Parks Advisory Board meeting in September and give us more information about Section 30. We, at this point, are also planning a meeting with the city this Friday, actually, to continue discussion about options. Harmony Sports Association, our staff, and even Parks Advisory Board members will be present for that discussion. And of course, as I mentioned, Harmony had asked us to bring this matter up for council for discussion and some support. And specifically to discuss a couple of options, if we could go to next slide. So as you again already heard, you know, there's this matter of Northeast 13th. There's also a potential relocation. So we're calling it option A and B. They're not, you know, there could be other options, but the few options that we've discussed and kind of narrowed down with our partners are either some sort of a agreement with the city where the street does not go through the park, and or relocation of the park to a different location. With that said, there's a caveat to option second option, option B, and that is our partners, Harmony Sports Complex, have gone through all of their assets, all of their investments, all of the work that they put in into making that facility the great facility that it is today, and they identified about $12 to $15 million in additional replacement costs that they believe are needed for a relocation to occur successfully, including potentially collateral such as funding and land and things of that nature. Next slide, please. So I know this is terrible to read, I do apologize, but this is a very high-level summary of those assessments that the association had shared with us, what they call the improvement value, and they've done everything from looking at every field to every building as much as they could, and that is where that number is coming from. Next, please. So I've mentioned earlier that we've had a few meetings, including meetings with McKay and Spacito, to talk about different potential options for the park if it was to move, in this case, moving it to the west and completely south of 13th. This is one of what we call the final draft concepts that we discussed with Harmony Sports Complex. It is not the final, and like Ahmad said, and I think Bill mentioned too, we haven't been able to reach a full mutual agreement on this specific concept, largely because of the size of the land available, the leverage to make all of the replacements that are both currently at the site and potential extended assets. So this is kind of where we left off back in May, June, and at that point, Harmony had requested that we bring this issue up for your attention.
Also, Galina, if I can mention, so the plan that you see here was part of the result of the workshops we had with the Harmony Complex staff. We held a kind of workshop with our consultant back in March 10 of this year, and they came up with 8 different options, and this was the one that was the top or the most favorable. And what this one does is covers replacement of all the infrastructure in terms of ball fields and also the future parking layout for the area. And I think that I think it was about 3 acres or so, that the discrepancy in terms of what we have up north and south. But in terms of facility, this one totally replaces or gives you the outline what the existing infrastructure and going is if we decide to go on south. And one of the other reasons for this layout was to kind of get the park totally out of any kind of bisect by major roadway. So that in the long run, there will be a facility that's contained in one location that provides accessibility to any kind of activity happening in baseball or softball games and also soccer. And the other thing was to making sure preserving those existing 3 soccer fields that with artificial turfs that are very expensive to relocate. So this was one of, I think, the other reason made that option higher. And the other thing also, I want to give a recognition to Galina and her team. And as a part of the goodwill gesture for the Harmony Sport Complex, we went and regraded the parking lot because the parking lot was in a bad shape, and put some gravel and compacted it so be ready for this coming season. So that's ready for them to use until we finalize and build that parking lot as part of the grant.
Thank you, Ahmad. I'll turn it actually back to you for the closing comments.
To Ahmad for the closing comments, Galina?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay.
So I think that we wanted to just bring the update on the project, and then also the request of the association on the 13th Street construction. And we are going to be, as Galina mentioned, we're going to be talking to the City of Vancouver to determine if there are other options about 13th Street. But if they insist that 13th Street goes through there, then we'd like to maybe continue at the relocation and the concept that we come back and presented you today and refinement on those. And then later on kind of talk about those funding options. But we're going to be continuing working on that. So we'd like to get additional input or any other direction that council would like us to follow.
Other comments of the council? I would hope there are.
Question.
Did you-
So I'm with the that diagram that you showed us, or the proposal on page 14. I mean, that's got so much merit to it. I mean, it looks great, but I see it does go. It requires a land swap and would go into the contour of what is now a quarry. And I'm wondering how much would this cost to restore, to get the contours to where you could build those fields. I mean, how much is that going to cost to build this proposed draft concept?
Thank you, Council, for the question. We have not reached that point. One of the idea was to start a conversation with a property owner, Rajke, and I want to give them credit. They have been really, because they're part of the community, they're open to discussion and do whatever they can to help out. So the idea was to make sure that we come up with a solid or agreement with what the park, the layout is going to be. And the next idea was to have a conversation with City of Vancouver, Rajke, and us, so we can come up with a kind of develop agreement and phase development of the area as we do the property swap. And the idea was to make sure that the replacement of the existing facility to the new area is no zero cost to the county or for us. But if there are future additional improvements, that'll be part of our discussion. But that's how we have told the Harmony Sport Complex and also Rajke. And the area, yeah, there's been mine, and there are some different ideas on how to fill that area, do some grading and some mining, and it's going to be a phased approach. It'll probably take us a few years to get it built, but the idea is that will be the final layout to make sure that all the infrastructures move to the south as the developer improves or develop to the north of 13th Street.
Did that answer your question?
Well, it does. We haven't gotten to the plans to a point where we have any idea what the costs would be. And so in any case, I just happened to have been at the parks meeting where this issue was discussed in earnest. And certainly I fully understand that, everyone associated with it right now at the Harmony Sports Association and the complex in general, they want to have the least harm to their park as possible. And I'm hopeful that the city will have an open mind to some of these options, because putting 13th Street to bisect the park as it now is constituted really is a very poor solution. And I know it may have been their original concept, but I'm hoping that they consider the changes that have occurred and the investments that have gone into that park since they came up with that long-range plan. 13th is not straight through right now with the park's ingress and egress, and it's a problem the way it's set up now without turn lanes, and anytime they have major family events and soccer clinics and things like that, there's just a huge traffic jam there. And obviously putting 13th through the park itself will create dangers to the kids in and around by bisecting the existing park. So if we can't between the staffs, if there isn't progress with the city, I think we might want to support the request to object to the extension of Northeast 13th Street. I'm kind of leaning that way after being at that parks meeting.
Yeah, thank you,
Councilor Blum.
Sorry, Chair Brian. Because when we had the approval of that contract, when I think you approved it last year, and I had made a commitment that I was going to go and talk to the City of Vancouver about maybe if they allow some kind of road modification or not building the road or just be a little small access, because our concern was for safety and having the kids go back and forth between the two parks. And and that's how we started it. And the other thing I had mentioned to City of Vancouver, that this park is a huge asset for them too. So we want their partnership and how that encompasses as part of Section 30. So it is a huge amenity in how this area around it gets developed too.
Councilor Blum.
I would be very much supportive of having the Harmony Sports Association come and present to council time. I think they can answer some of the questions that Councilor Medvedev raised in terms of what this would actually cost to replace what's there, not build out to full level, but just replace the current assets. And just from the numbers that they've already shared, that's a number that's going to be in the millions, which in my mind then raises two questions. One, where are we possibly going to get that money when we've been talking about the budget challenges and the deficits for parks that we already have? But the bigger question is, why should we spend millions to replace something that we already have now? So I would be very supportive of opposing the extension of 13th Street. I think we have quite a bit of leverage with the city. They don't own the right of way. They need us to give them that right of way to build that. So they can't build it without working with us. So I think looking at what options may be out there would be important. I think the Harmony Sports Association, they have a lot of knowledge of the area, and I know they've done some engagement with some traffic engineers and may have some ideas as well that we could take to the city. So I would hope that we could invite them to come and speak to council time next Wednesday. But would agree with Councilor Medvedev. I think we should oppose the extension of 13th Street. One other quick addition, there's also a real safety issue with where the parking lot is now, and I think Councilor Medvedev alluded to that, but it's a dangerous intersection. It's right on my way from my house to Costco. So Saturdays I go by there, and the number of times that people have pulled out or had to hit brakes, it's frequent. So I think there is a real motivator for the city to want to address the safety there, which we tried to do in the site plan, but they opposed. So I think we have a good case to make to the city, and hope that we would support the Sports Association in this.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Councilor Rose.
Yeah, and I would agree. We have a great relationship with Harmony Sports Complex, and we've done some terrific things with them. And this is really, I would think the city of Vancouver would want to be involved in this great public-private partnership and something that's this critical to our community. So, I mean, I would hope, and I'm putting all the faith and confidence in staff, that we could negotiate this in some way that makes sense for everyone for the long term. And I hope we don't have to formally oppose this in some hearings examiner way, but if we do, we do. But I would think we'd be able to come to some negotiated agreement with the city of Vancouver in some way on this park and this road. And if it has to bubble up to the city council level, I think we expend all of our effort to try to negotiate this and work this out prior to any real formal opposition of the road. So I'm just asking us to kind of go to the mat to see what we can do here to support Harmony Sports Complex. And then I would enjoy hearing from them directly as well. I read through the PowerPoint that they sent. I think they presented to the Parks Board last couple weeks ago. So anyway, I'm all on board to try to do what we can to continue this partnership and make these improvements to the park.
Other comments?
Yes, I agree with what's already been said. I think that there's incredible investment there already. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me to pull everything up and move it, especially at the additional expense. So I fully support staff trying to work out what you can. And should something not be able to work out, yes, I'd be in support of opposing the 13th Street punch through. Hopefully it doesn't have to come to that. It seems like this is something, things are at the level where this is the time when we can figure this out. So I hope we can.
And I would say, looking at this project at the very beginning, the understanding I had that it really wasn't going to be any cost to us, and so this is a whole different look. I mean, it's a revelation, I guess, and I would like to hear from the Harmony Sports Association as well, the details of it. I would hope that we can work it out, but as it is, it looks to me like even the replacement of these fields is beyond our capability financially, really. I don't know where we would get the money. And as has been said by all the other counselors, you have this facility already. So, but I also agree that that parking lot, that entrance and that ingress and egress at the parking lot there at Harmony Sports Complex is a tough one and a dangerous one. So hopefully we can do something about that. So what I hear then is that we would like to hear from Harmony Sports Complex perhaps next week at our council time, if that's at all possible. And also to continue working on this so that we can find agreement. They are looking for us to give a formal, well, we saw the two options. So they're looking for us to take action on one of those two options, and hearing from them directly, I think, would be good prior to taking formal action on those. Is that what I hear?
May I add to that just a bit? I don't want to complicate the scheduling. I don't know what their availability is, but certainly if we can arrange it for next week, I'm assuming we're going to do it by Zoom. Perhaps we can invite the Vancouver City Council to listen in and to watch the same presentation that we receive.
Ahmad?
Yes, Madam Chair. I wanted to, since we mentioned that we're going to have a meeting with City of Vancouver, also the Sport Harmony Complex staff and us on Friday. So we can also give you an update next week to our discussion and what some of the direction we get. So we might have a solution or some ideas by that time too. So if you can allow us to give you an update on next Wednesday after our meeting with them on Friday.
So Ahmad, are you saying that wait until you meet with them, you give us a report before we invite them to listen in on the conversation?
Or we could, it's totally up to you, but I think we can probably give you a more update, and they can also give a presentation from their perspective. But I think on Friday, we'll probably get a lot of answers to a lot of questions we have. The city's willingness to work with us, and also the Sport Harmony Complex will be a part of the meeting. They will hear a lot of response from the city as well.
Okay, so Councilor Bill.
So just really quick, they are preparing to present next week. They knew this was an option that we were going to ask them to, and I've been in touch with them. So they will be ready to go next Wednesday if we ask them to be so.
And Chair O'Brien, this is Kathleen. I can certainly send this link also to the city manager so he could see the presentation that happened today, and let him know that they will be continuing conversations, or you'll be continuing conversations next Wednesday.
Okay, thank you. Is there a majority of the council that would like to hear directly from Harmony Sports Association? I see two. Okay, all right. I don't see the two other women. For whatever reason, I don't have a frame that includes everybody. But at any rate, I see two fingers. I'll go along with that. So we'll ask them then to present next Wednesday. Thank you both, Galina and Ahmad, for your presentation today.
Thank you, Council, for your time. I appreciate it.
Okay. Moving on to the marijuana code.
Chair O'Brien, I just wanted to briefly check my microphone. This is Taylor Hall. It
Yes.
sounds like you can hear me. Thank you.
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Okay, so I will go ahead and start this topic. So you'll recall that back in May, the council, there was a Scrivener's error, and the council needed to adopt an ordinance to correct the Scrivener's error. And at the time, the council decided to adopt an interim ordinance that with the question remaining in terms of what to do with substance abuse disorder treatment facilities and how to treat those as it relates to the marijuana establishments. The questions really were, how do we define a substance abuse treatment facility within the code if we're going to include them? And so the primary question is if we include them, and if so, what the distance is, and then how we define them if we're going to include them. And so I reached out to public health and community services staff to get their feedback in terms of the definition. And I'll have that for you in just a minute. But the main question to start with is whether or not we even include a distance requirement for the substance abuse treatment facilities. So the reason this is coming up today, before we get to that question, is that the interim ordinance is set to expire 6 months from its adoption, which puts it at about November 6th. And so I'm hoping to get this on for a hearing the last date in October. That gives the council an additional hearing in case there's lingering questions, that we could squeak it in right by the deadline, but I'm hoping to schedule this for the second public hearing that we have scheduled for October so that we could get a permanent ordinance in place. So the initial question, as I said, is whether or not we include substance abuse disorder treatment facilities as a limiting factor in terms of where marijuana establishments can be cited. And what you see before you is an admittedly crude map of the substance abuse disorder treatment facilities that are located in the unincorporated county. Of course, we have more SUD treatment facilities in the county as a whole, but those are all located within city boundaries. So these are the ones that you see. I will note, just for clarification, it appears that there's a blue line off to the top right. Technically, there is a substance abuse disorder treatment facility located at Larch Mountain Correctional Facility, but given that location, we're not really worried about what's within proximate distance of that facility. So what you see here is really what we would be concerned with in terms of the proximate distance. You'll see that there's 2 located actually on Highway 99, one down on Northeast 61st Street, and then you have one on 26th Avenue, one that's out in Brush Prairie, and then 2 kind of along that 117th Avenue corridor. So I'll open it up for discussion in terms of whether we should include these as approximate distance. I will note in my reach out to both public health staff, community services staff, and their discussions with stakeholders, that the perspective from staff and the stakeholders is that there really isn't a necessary basis to limit the distance between substance abuse disorder treatment facilities and marijuana establishments. The director of Lifeline Connections gave the example that when somebody goes in for treatment related to an alcohol addiction, and everybody who goes into treatment, the goal is to have them be able to engage in regular daily life, knowing that there's going to be temptations and how to address those temptations, and gave the example of somebody who goes into treatment for an alcohol addiction, that they receive help in terms of how do they go into a grocery store and purchase their groceries without feeling tempted to purchase alcohol, which of course is sold at most grocery stores. So that was the example that he gave, but I will open it up for a discussion on that point. And then if the council does decide to move forward to include them as a limiting factor, then we can talk about distance and how we would define an SUD treatment facility.
Okay, I'd open up for discussion.
Madam Chair,
I would like to, go ahead, Councilor Rose.
Actually, I was wondering if Taylor could actually also review the Scrivener's error, which was the beginning of the emergency. There was 2 things, right? The Scrivener's error and then this distance question. Could we get that one as well before we talk about this one?
Sure, Councillor, you're correct. There was a Scrivener's error during the biannual code amendments last year, where the council was making some changes to the sign code, essentially, as it relates to the to marijuana facilities. And as a part of that, essentially it reverted to an older code. And I think it's fair to characterize that as a Scrivener's error in the biannual code amendments, and that there wasn't really an intent on the part of the council to revert to a 2014 code but in an abundance of caution, and in order to make sure the record was clear on that issue, the council adopted an interim ordinance to clarify what the code was. And on top of that, As Lindsay noted, the council addressed this, temporarily addressed the substance use disorder treatment issue as an amendment to that interim ordinance. So the two issues are kind of tied together right now, at least in terms of timing and the expiration of the interim ordinance. So it is something to be aware of. Were the interim ordinance to expire, I think we'd probably still be in Scrivener's error territory as it relates to that biannual code amendment, but it certainly would leave room for confusion.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I just wanted to review that, because we really do need to address this code in October to just deal with that issue in particular. So we'll have this on the agenda then to deal with in October. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear, as well as however we talk about the substance use disorder treatment facilities.
Okay, I'll open it up for discussion then. Any discussion about this? Whether we want to, I guess the discussion is, do we want to keep this distance from treatment facilities in this ordinance?
Yes, I think it's, do we want to use this as a restricting category? And then if so, talk about the distance. I appreciate the additional information. I'm in favor of keeping the classification as a restriction. While I recognize the input that Lindsay gave from Lifeline, I think that recovery is something that is an ongoing process for a lot of people. It's not a one and done. And while, yes, the goal of a lot of treatment and recovery programs are to help individuals navigate, I guess I just really consider it in poor taste to put a facility close to a place where people are trying to address recovery. It's not that there aren't going to be other temptations, but simply that we spend a lot of taxpayer dollars on recovery in this community. And I think that it would be a good nod toward saying that we care as much about the recovery community as we do about those who are going to make money off of the community that chooses to partake in marijuana. So I would support leaving it in. And as far as the language, if we were to go with it, I'm fine with the suggestion of the additional clarification of substance abuse disorder treatment facilities as defined as a program for persons with a substance use disorder provided by a treatment program licensed or certified by the Washington State Department of Health as meeting the standards adopted per state law. That is long enough to perhaps provide enough clarity to get where we need to get. And then as a further point, we already have 5 sites in the unincorporated county. So this would really largely just be setting something up for any future endeavors. It wouldn't necessarily impact anyone who is already established. Thank you.
And the distance, do you have a suggestion for that?
I think the conversation earlier was 500, and I would be okay with that.
As far as the distance, the council can set any value that's over 100 feet. It's the state minimum.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear what Lindsay just said regarding the distance. And I'd really like to hear from John and Julie's as the other two that had originally voted to allow it in the unincorporated area. I'd like to hear what their view is. But Lindsay, I couldn't understand what you just said.
I apologize. The state law minimum is 100 feet. So the council can choose any distance 100 feet or greater.
So my first comment would be, I wish the map had zoning and 500-foot circles. That was sort of what I was hoping we would have, so we could really see kind of what that impact might look like on where these potential facilities could be located in the future. But But generally, I think, this was something that Councillor Lentz brought up early in our discussion around the code and allowing marijuana facilities, and I supported it at the time. But I don't know that we did this work ahead of time to really understand the impacts of what that would mean to license holders. And again, I still wish I had a little bit different map. But so I think for me, as we're cleaning up this code, I would, and hearing from the community and hearing from our stakeholders, that the alcohol conversation and argument does make sense to me. As if we're trying to help folks recover, we're trying to help them recover in an environment that's real and where we live, and where we do have liquor stores and restaurants and bars and grocery stores, and a lot more of those than we have of these. So I would frankly support just removing it from our code completely, so that we don't have it in there. It complicates things. We don't have any license holders or certificate holders, I don't think, right now. So this would again be a conversation about whether we have future license holders in Clark County. But I think we just simplify the code.
I would be fine with putting it back in with the 500 feet. I think it was a part of it when we passed it. And I think that's part of why it passed. My willingness to remove it, I think, was largely due to some of the challenges in implementation that led to just problems in how this was executed. So I would be fine with reinstating the code as amended with that extra clarification. I do think it's largely an academic exercise, as the chance of new licenses are pretty slim, I think, in the foreseeable future. So that's where I'd be at with it. But I would agree, though, with Councilor Olson. I think the most important thing that we need to make sure we do is to deal with the Scrivener's error. And so I don't know that we're necessarily going to get majority one way or the other on this issue, but I think making sure that we deal with that Scrivener's error come October is important.
Councilor Mataji, do you have any comment?
Sure. So having heard all three, obviously you and I first voted against allowing it in the unincorporated area, and that's not the issue today. So number one, I want to be done hearing about marijuana. We have so many things on our plate that are really important and complicated, and so we need to deal with the Scrivener's error. Let's fix that. As far as needing additional complication on distancing and things like that, I would just, in my experience as, not only as a prosecutor and judge and as a father, across America, across the world, drugs, alcohol, they're available everywhere. And so, I obviously am a very firm proponent of offering detox and rehab services and diversions from our court system. I am all about treatment. And the reality is, no matter where these facilities are, they're here. They're in most of our cities. They're going to be in our unincorporated area. And no matter where someone who is struggling with sobriety lives or travels or exists, they're going to be walking by this stuff, whether it's street drugs or marijuana or alcohol. So I think it does overly complicate the code. I would just as soon, let's fix this Scrivener's error. Let's not add any additional limitations and code that the state does not require. So I'd be in favor of removing that additional requirement.
So, I mean, we've heard from everybody, and my voice is that I was against this from the very beginning, not this particular portion of the code. And astonishingly, I agree with Councilor Lentz on this one. I do think that it should remain in, and it should be 500 feet. And although even fixing the Scrivener's error is not something I even want to deal with, but we're going to, because we need to fix the error. And so that would be my stance. And so that, with that said, it sounds to me like, Councilor Blum, did you say you were in favor of leaving this in or not?
Yes.
So we have 3 people who would like for this part of the code to remain in at 500 feet is what I believe I heard Councilor Lentz say was the original suggestion, and that it should be that.
So to clarify, my plan will be I'm going to work with the PA's office. We'll get the code drafted that will keep the SUD treatment facility limitation in place at the 500-foot level, but add that clarifying language regarding what constitutes an SUD treatment facility. And so that is what we will have before you at the hearing in October, unless I'm missing.
Okay, no, I think that's it.
Lindsay, can I ask one clarifying question? As it relates to the language in terms of defining a substance use disorder treatment facility, Lindsay provided some language that I think is a good place to start, and maybe the council's intent. I did wanted to ask, though, be a clarifying question, because one of the issues that we had with the earlier language is this question of whether a facility that was licensed to have a substance use disorder treatment program, but wasn't currently hosting a program, whether that qualified as a restricted facility or not. And I think there are probably a couple ways to handle this, but having a brighter line, I should say, that is whether a treatment facility is licensed or not to have a program would be something that would be easier to determine. Whereas factually, whether a program is active or not could be a challenging thing to determine, and for an applicant or the county. So that's something that we may want to consider in the next steps.
And I would,
Rebecca, can you scroll down on the document that you have? The language should come up. Oh, never mind. That was the addresses. I apologize. Okay.
so I would suggest that we put in there, in that definition, licensed to treat, because that's the point. If they've already gone to the effort to license themselves to have this treatment facility, whether they're doing it or not, they obviously would do it at some point, or planned to at some point. So I would like to make that that more defining piece of the description or definition. Are there other?
If I may, and so that brings up the complexity that we're going to cause by adding more complexity. So what's the reciprocal point? So you have treatment facilities that may evolve or find a new location and then be within the 500 feet of an existing marijuana facility. Do we then prevent them from opening their treatment center if they found a good home or a building that's too close to a marijuana treatment or a marijuana store?
So a couple of things. First, to respond to what Councilor Medvedev just said, I believe that we have a grandfather generality so that something that is already open, if you have a pot shop and a treatment facility or a daycare or a school moves in next to you, they don't boot you out. But with regard to the licensing, the language that Lindsay suggested in the email that she sent around and that I kind of buzzed through because it is quite lengthy, does include the language defined as a program for persons with a substance use disorder provided by a treatment program licensed or certified by the Washington State Department of Health as meeting the standards adopted by state law. So the proposed further clarified language does include that.
Okay, does that meet your criteria?
I think it's something, knowing that if that's the council's intent, I think it's something that Lindsay and I can work together with on language to make the sure it's the licensure of the facility to perform that is the bright line, and Lindsay and I can work on language to meet that intent.
Okay, thank you. Because I see, actually, Councilor Medvigi, I see that this not further complicates, but actually clarifies and makes it simpler, because you don't have to go and find treatment people that are doing treatment, even though whether they're licensed or not. So I see this as a clarifying point, and as Taylor said, a brighter line than more complicating it. So at any rate, I think we've covered this, and you and Lindsay Taylor can work on the language to make it even more crystal clear.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to move on then to new business. And there was a proposed, there's something on the agenda that Councillor Lentz brought forward, which is the guest ranches into county code. And I'm just going to make a statement here that when we put things on the agenda, we actually have to have the support of a councillor needs to have the support of 2 other councillors. And I'm assuming that happened because I did send Councillor Lentz an email to that effect. Is that the case?
I believe it is, but I also don't know that that bringing stuff forward to talk about isn't necessarily something that we've said we have to have 3 votes to talk about. I mean, if you'd like to take a tally, and then if it turns out there aren't votes, I can just bring this up in councilor communications.
No, we're not going to do that. We don't do decision-making items.
This is not a decision-making item.
Just a minute. Let me finish. Actually, our rules and procedures do state that the 2 other councillors have to agree to an agenda item.
Okay.
So at any rate, we don't need to take a tally. I guess I would ask you, Councillor Lentz, do you have any relationship with regard to these ranches or people that own them?
Nope. They came to me with a request.
So you don't know them personally and are friends with them?
No.
Okay. That's not what I understand, but go ahead and go forward with this.
Well, and I'm not sure it would matter one way or the other if it's a code we want to consider and if it makes sense for agritourism. I mean, I don't think there's any illusion that there's some benefit to Councillor Lentz for bringing it forward.
Well, if I could comment, because here's what I was afraid of. Number one, I wanted to clarify. I don't know if we're getting into an executive session or not, but this property I understand involves another equestrian facility that's under code enforcement. And while number one, I want to avoid code enforcement on any area that we're considering changing the code. And I think building permits, building requirements, whether they're ag exempt for whether it's equestrian use or other rural business use, it's all folds into the greater subject. So I don't want to deal with this property specifically because if we go ahead and talk about pursuing this code change, which I do support and want to do, but for the greater rural business question, we would then stop the code enforcement against this one property, where I think we should stop the code enforcement against all those properties that are similarly situated. So if there was some kind of relationship between one councillor and this facility, and we kind of did this back door to stop code enforcement to benefit this one property owner, I think that would give a really bad impression to the community, especially to the other equestrian facility that's still under code enforcement. So one, I'd like to stop all code enforcement on these building code issues because we are about to reconsider all of that code. And I think it would be fair to the entirety of the community and provide some relief to this one ranch owner immediately, as well as the other horse facilities that are similarly under code enforcement right now. So it's kind of not along the objection that the chair was making, but I did want to highlight all those points. I read the letter, I talked to the lawyer. I think they were good code suggestions that I really would support, but it gets into this larger equestrian conversation, and it gets into the larger rural business conversation. So I don't want to just piecemeal this.
I guess
just for from my limited understanding of this, but I know this was sent to the council, this has nothing to do with code enforcement.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to provide that clarification from my understanding, and we will discuss code enforcement at another time.
Okay, my understanding is just the opposite, that this property owner was told that if we are going to consider this code revision for ranches, that they would cease and desist from code enforcement against this ranch.
I'd like to hear from Councilor Lentz. Maybe she
had
it on the agenda. Maybe she can provide some background.
So first of all, the request right now is simply to say, here's a proposal. Can we have council approval to move it to staff for consideration to come back to us for integration and further discussion, work session moving forward? There has been enforcement conversation around this, but not in the same vein as the other equestrian issues. What this is an entrepreneurial business out in the rural area that currently does not have a code designation for what it is. It's a guest ranch at a facility that houses Clydesdales. It's not a riding facility. It's not an active equestrian facility. And the business owners, in pursuing permits for work they were doing on the site, encountered in an inspection that they were running up against being unable to move forward because they didn't fit into any of the categories we had. So accordingly, they, after going through much effort and many conversations, enlisted an attorney, and they have a proposal for adding the classification, because what they'd like to do is move forward properly. This didn't arise out of code enforcement actions. This didn't arise from a negative place. This arose from wanting to find a way to allow this business, which is great for local tourism and economic development, and taking advantage of the wonderful resources we do have in the rural area, to allow it to move forward. And so the proposal is to say, can we talk about it?
If that is a clear explanation of what is happening, I would be very much in favor of having this placed in the code, because I do think we need this sort of thing, business and entrepreneurial things in our rural areas. So I have no objection to having our staff look at this, especially if it is not as was characterized, that it was coming sort of from a negative place rather than a positive place. I just don't want to get into the possibility of what was discussed by Councilor Nedvigi. But I'm in favor of moving it forward. And if we have if we have enough people that are interested in this, we can move it forward to the staff to look at.
I'd be supportive of that. And this is coming from a lack of code where we don't have a definition for this. So this is providing an opportunity that doesn't previously exist. So I would love to get staff to take a look at this and see if it makes sense to add to the code.
Yeah, I would, Madam Chair, I would agree. I think it makes sense for us to take a look at this. And I guess just for another side comment, I guess I would like we give each other the benefit of the doubt and maybe get some background before I don't know where you or Councilor Medved heard that there was something else going on here, but it would seem to be that we would give Councilor Lentz the opportunity to present what she had prepared before we conclude that there's some other motive. So just generally.
Yeah, so I think you totally misunderstood what I said, Councilor Olson. So let me clarify. So we're going to, number one, there were no complaints that came from the public about this facility. This was generated by code enforcement. And so I'm all in favor of stopping the code enforcement. But what I was afraid of is the appearance for the other equestrian uses that I'm advocating that we stop code enforcement because they are similarly situated. I was just asking that we do that for them as well. So we eliminate any possible appearance of having one counselor just bring it for relief. So they are related. And I might add that, you know, originally when we started talking about rural businesses, we were told, or at least I was told, that most of the businesses that may be out in the community would be authorized by the code, and that therefore we didn't need a code change. But this is an example where it isn't authorized, and so they're having trouble getting their permits. So we do need to fix that, and I'm all in favor of it. So I'm hearing agreement by everyone that this should be looked at and hopefully approved. But I just want to add, we just need to take a position, you know, contrary to our last vote on that issue, to stop code enforcement on these equestrian and rural properties that involve the very code that we're looking to change.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to me that when we talked about the equestrian code and how we were going to address it, that we did determine that we were going to kind of put a halt to those things that were being addressed by code enforcement that might be subject to change. Did I understand that wrongly?
If I can please interject. Yes, the council did provide guidance on code enforcement on what would be enforced and what would not be enforced as we move forward with the public participation plan. There will be further discussion, not at this time, but there will be further discussion with the council. So I would ask that we continue that conversation at a later time.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on then. We will ask staff, just as we have discussed, we'll move this to the staff to take a look at this code. Councilor reports. Work session requests. Is that, you're muted, Kathleen.
I believe we have staff on to talk about the work session request for the 2020 annual review and docket. Is that Oliver or Sharon? Are you still there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Oliver.
Thank you. And it looked like good afternoon, councillors and Madam Chair. This is only an ask. We are about to have a planning commission hearing, be it visual, on the 2020 annual reviews and dockets. We have about 5 or 6 items that will be going to hearing on October 15th. So we're asking that we have a work session, reserve a date for a work session with the council. That's really the ask for item 4.1.
Okay, council, I'm in favor.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, we can move forward. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Camp Bonneville.
I am on the phone, Kathleen. Galina Berlin.
Okay, Galina, go ahead.
Councilors, we're asking to come to you in a work session format to provide you with an update on the cleanup logistics at Camp Bonneville and to also discuss the master planning strategy for that site. We're hopeful to come to you this year, if at all possible.
Any comments by the council? I don't see a problem coming to us to at least give us an update. I don't know how much decision making should happen. Comments of the council?
The only comment I was making is I'm still going to advocate that we get a regional participation by citizens in looking at uses. And I want to get to that as soon as we can, even before we hire a consultant, if we end up doing that. And I understand we're getting close to having the final cleanup done, especially the Probestill neighborhood area. I know we don't have an association formalized yet. I'm getting a lot of questions from constituents out in that area. What is happening? We haven't heard anything. So I'm hoping that we can make this a very public and transparent update, if you will, to the public.
Other comments? I do agree about the regionality of this. If this becomes a park, it will be a regional park, and therefore we need the input from individuals around the entire county for this. Any objection? Let's put it this way. Is there any objection to bringing this forward this year?
Just to clarify what Public Works has already stated, that this is just to provide the council an update on the cleanup work, as well as discuss potential next steps, such for options for public input. So this is not making any decisions, it's just talking about, and that's where you can have the discussion of how that public input may look, whether it's this year or next year.
Okay, thank you, because we do get these reports on cleanup and et cetera each year. So let's go forward with that. Thank you, Galina. You can bring that forward and talk to whomever makes these arrangements for putting this on the agenda for another time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, you all.
Thank you. Moving to the 6-year stormwater capital plan.
Yes, good afternoon, councilors. Jeff Schnabel with Clean Water Division. Ahmad had to run off to another engagement here, so hopefully I can answer questions for you. We are requesting a work session here coming up in October to have a chance to go over our 6-year stormwater capital plan with you all and get some feedback and some support for that. We hope to be bringing this for council adoption at the November 3rd council meeting, which is concurrent with the time you'll be considering the 6-year transportation improvement program. And the other thing that's actually kind of a new piece this year, just so you're aware, and we would like to discuss at the work session with you, is a 20-year stormwater capital planning process that we are starting this year. We've got kind of a first iteration for you to comment on and take a look at. We're kind of at a high level strategy point at this point, and then by next year in 2021, we hope to bring kind of a more comprehensive plan forward for adoption. So looking forward to talking to you all about that. If there's questions, I can try to answer them.
If we have time to have this work session prior to the November 3rd hearing, I'm assuming that those who are familiar with what the schedule is, that we definitely need to hear this. So any objection to having this work session come before us prior to the November hearing? I see none. Thank you, Jeff. Go ahead and prepare for us. Thank
All right,
you.
will do. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Moving on to the 2021 Community Planning Work Plan work session.
Yes, Madam Chair. Each year, typically in late fall, community planning reviews our work program with council in a work session, and typically you approve that work session. You approve our work program maybe at a council time or at a different council meeting. So I'm requesting a work session with council to review our work program and hopefully approve that. And that will give me the opportunity to focus on your top priorities and also give me the opportunity to how we utilize staff in community planning to also meet those priorities, as well as helping me to prepare my 2021 budget, department budget. So I'm looking forward to the work session with the council. Probably be an hour and a half, which typically I won't say much. I will let staff do all the talking. So we'll get out before 1.5 hours.
So, Oliver, this does not include, though, the annual review and dockets, or does it? Because it will be in addition to that, or will these two things be together, or no? This is the work plan will take an hour and a half?
Yeah, it typically, yeah, sometimes the council has questions or the council will put other project on the list. Hopefully by the time we have the work session in November, we will know how many docket requests have come, so we can add that to the list and have you approve that as well. That typically, as you know, the docket is free. So when it's free, I have to find a way to, maybe ask for more budget, or maybe said I can do that within the budget limitation that I have.
Yes, yes. Okay, I understand. Any objection to the work session prior to, is it November that you need, prior to November, Oliver?
Yes.
Okay.
We
got a lot of work to do.
Is always adopted in December, so that will give me any opportunity to adjust the budget if I have to for your approval.
All right. Okay, is there any objection from any councilors? We're going to have a heavy schedule here. Hearing none, we will schedule that work session as well. Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, we're going to move on to our next item, which is policy issues. Lindsay, do you have anything in addition to what we did with the legislature this morning, or the legislative?
Nothing for sure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We are going to adjourn then to go into executive session. Actually, for one of the executive sessions, as for RCW 4231-10-1A, for 20 minutes, and only one potential litigation, which is 20 minutes, with no action following. So if there's nothing else, we will adjourn this meeting, leave, and then sign into our executive session. Have I covered everything before we leave?
And I would just recommend that maybe take a 2 to 3 minute break between now and the executive session. So
okay, that sounds good. Absolutely. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.